Welcome to the Bogosity podcast for the 30th of April 2012, the podcast that, when ordered to jump, says, how low? This is your host, Shane Killian. Let's ruin the credit of the news of the bogus. And yes, it's another credit downgrade for the U.S. government, this time from Egan-Jones. They've downgraded the U.S.'s rating from AA+ to just AA over worries about sustainability of the public debt. Last year, S&P cut the U.S. government's rating from AAA to AA+, and while they maintained that rating, Egan-Jones went one step further, citing statistics showing the national debt rising to 112% of GDP by the end of 2013. According to Managing Director Sean Egan, quote, "When debt to GDP exceeds 100%, a country's financial flexibility becomes increasingly strained. For the first time since World War II, U.S. debt exceeds 100%. Obviously, the current course is not enhancing credit quality. Without some structural changes soon, restoring credit quality will become increasingly difficult." You'd think that after another downgrade serving as a wake-up call to Congress and the President, they might take notice, but how did they react? In the worst way possible. The SEC has formally charged Egan-Jones for alleged misstatements from back in 2008. In an inexplicably bizarre action, the SEC pulled up a single obscure regulatory application from 4 years ago, while still taking no action at all against the ratings agencies that gave top ratings to bad mortgages in that same year, agencies that still rate the U.S. government as AAA. In a statement, the company said, quote, "Egan-Jones believes that the SEC's action is inexplicable, except as an effort to silence Egan-Jones and maintain the status quo of a conflicted, issuer-paid ratings agency monopoly." The timing of this action, combined with its absurdity, smacks of retaliation against the downgrade. But Egan-Jones believes the problem is deeper than that. The SEC, they claim, is biased against independent firms. Lawyers for the firm state that the charges are both unjust and untrue. The SEC has yet to comment. Think about what people claim about the SEC, why they say it's there, and why they say it's needed. And then ask yourself if this isn't the exact opposite of what the SEC is supposed to be doing. Far from keeping dangerous corporations at bay, it enables dangerous, politically connected corporations while keeping independence at bay. Egan-Jones, which is funded by its clients, has the incentive to work in their best interests, whereas the bigger, protected credit rating agencies are funded by the firms that issue the securities, turning the incentive structure on its head. Yet, those are protected by the SEC, even when they exacerbate an economic disaster. Corporatism at its finest. It's time to wake up, America. The federal government is not on your side. One more example of the police not protecting and serving. Michael Paxton had his home raided by the Austin Police Department, who shot his dog after getting, I know some of you have already guessed it, the wrong address. The APD was responding to a report of a domestic disturbance, but Officer T. Griffin apparently got the address wrong. He pointed his gun at an unarmed Paxton, who had his hands in the air, and Paxton's dog Cisco, an Australian cattle dog, came running as any dog would. Paxton told Griffin that the dog was harmless, but without even much of a pause, Griffin put a bullet in the dog's head, killing him instantly. Paxton wasn't even allowed to hold his dog as he died. All the officer had to do was ask questions, and the mistake could have been remedied in 5 minutes. He had no call whatsoever to even draw his gun, let alone point it at Paxton. Paxton was completely unarmed and submissive, and the one thing that police and soldiers are taught is that you never, ever, ever point your gun at someone until you're ready to kill them. Paxton said, quote, "He had a taser. He had pepper spray. I don't understand why, in broad daylight, he pulled a gun on me. I wasn't running. I wasn't hiding. I was just saying, I live here. I was panicking. I was afraid for my life." Australian cattle dogs are small dogs and very sweet. Griffin was in no danger whatsoever from the dog. It's a shame it wasn't the other way around. A policeman should discharge his weapon only when absolutely necessary, and there wasn't anything close to an absolute necessity here. According to Austin Police Corporal Anthony Hippolito, quote, "The officer was basically in retreat and asked the owner to grab the dog. He was unable to, and the dog continued to attack, and that's when the officer discharged his firearm." No, he wasn't in retreat. He had his gun pointed at an innocent, unarmed man. And the reason why Paxton was unable to control the dog is because Griffin had his gun pointed at him. Later, Austin Police Chief Art Acevedo apologized to Paxton live on the radio. Paxton responded, "I definitely appreciate the apology, Art. It does mean a lot, considering I haven't been contacted by anybody. To hear that from you, it does mean a lot to me." Very gracious of Paxton, but where is the justice? Griffin should absolutely be disciplined for his inexcusable behavior. His actions could have resulted in a much worse outcome than just shooting the dog. He put an innocent person at risk by pointing his gun to him. Is he really just going to get off scot-free? Apparently so. Paxton may appreciate the apology, but the rest of us are put at risk by what is becoming an epidemic in police behavior. If anyone else had done this, he would have been arrested for assault with a deadly weapon. Police should be held to a higher standard than citizens, not lower. Think it can't get any worse? Think again. A kindergarten student who threw a tantrum was arrested and charged by police with assault and damage to private property. They handcuffed and took away a 6-year-old girl. The girl, Celicia Johnson, was actually handcuffed and put in a holding cell. When her mother and her aunt came to pick her up, Celicia said that the handcuffs were really tight and hurt her wrists. Schools need to be able to deal properly with children who throw tantrums. Arresting a 6-year-old who very likely had no idea as to the nature of her actions is unthinkable. Punishment and even restraint is reasonable to a degree, but a criminal arrest, handcuffs, and a holding cell go way beyond anything reasonable. But again, this is what happens when you go to the police to deal with problems. They are a hammer and everyone looks like a nail. What's next? Riot teams at cafeteria food fights? And just when you think it can't possibly get any worse, it absolutely does. Michael Sanders was tortured and drowned when he was hogtied, tasered, and drowned by the police as his 2 minor children watched helplessly. According to the children, the father had committed no crime and engaged in no act of aggression against the police. But an officer then pepper sprayed him, tasered him repeatedly for about 10 minutes, then hogtied him by tying his ankles to his handcuffs behind his back. According to a complaint filed on behalf of the children, quote, decedent was then slammed onto a table in the residence's backyard, face down. An officer was observed with his knee on decedent's back while the decedent was hogtied, handcuffed, and face down. Decedent stated that he couldn't breathe and he needed water. An officer ran water from a hose into decedent's face and mouth to the point of making it more difficult for decedent to breathe. Decedent tried to move his mouth away from the water and gasped for air. A witness yelled, "He can't breathe, you're drowning him." But the officer continued running water over decedent's face. After turning the water off, the DOE officer continued to press his knee against decedent's back and continued to put pressure on it. Witnesses repeatedly asked officers to let decedent get up because he couldn't breathe, but their cries for help were ignored. By now, there were in excess of 15 deputies and officers at the scene. After some time passed, decedent had clear spit bubbles coming out of his mouth. Witnesses yelled at officers that decedent was not breathing and pointed to the clear spit bubbles, but again were ignored. DOE officer claimed decedent was faking it. Officers, after much pleading from witnesses, checked decedent's pulse and discovered he had stopped breathing after not feeling anything when they touched decedent's neck. Decedent had his handcuffs taken off and was untied and placed on his back on the ground. After some time had passed, an officer started doing chest compressions, but none of the officers administered mouth-to-mouth resuscitation to the decedent. Ultimately, a witness at the scene administered CPR to decedent. Sometime later, an ambulance arrived and took over trying to revive decedent. Folks, this speaks for itself. This was nothing more than torture and brutal murder. Once a suspect is restrained, nothing more needs to be done. And what was with that officer doing chest compressions? Aren't they trained in CPR? Don't they know that chest compressions are worthless without mouth-to-mouth? They also aren't supposed to use tasers on bare skin. The current is made strong so it can penetrate clothing, yet Sanders was naked at the time. Some people are saying that tasers are the problem, but it seems to me to be much deeper than that. Police repeatedly tasering people after they've been subdued. Police using tasers as crowd control and compliance measures instead of just for officer defense. And in this case, the taser was just a tool for torture. The problem is police, particularly horrible, sadistic police officers who usually face no accountability for their horrendous actions. Why else would they be so brazen as to commit such an act in front of over a dozen witnesses? They clearly feared no repercussions for their actions. It's a concept that goes back to ancient Rome. Who watches the watchman? There must be accountability to the system, and a complete destruction of the blind trust people are encouraged and sometimes even required to put in police officers. Yet they always oppose any such efforts to do so. Good police officers wouldn't have a problem with it, and the best ones would support it. The fact that there is so much opposition shows that this problem is far, far greater than a few isolated instances in this country. So many of our liberties are threatened because of so-called cybercrimes. Reports calculate the damage at $1 trillion, easily 3 times as worse as the illegal drug trade. So obviously government needs broad new powers to fight this scourge, right? One problem: an economic analysis has shown that every single cybercrime report studied has an upward bias. They show the problem to be much worse than it really is. According to the study's authors, quote, "Such widely circulated cybercrime statistics are generated using absurdly bad statistical methods, making them wholly unreliable. When extrapolating from a surveyed group to the overall population, there is an enormous difference between preference questions, which are used in election polls, and numerical questions, as in cybercrime surveys." They point out the very absurdity of the conclusions, which fly in the face of basic economics. Quote, "Credentials and stolen credit card numbers are offered for sale at pennies on the dollar for the simple reason that they are hard to monetize. Structurally, the economics of cybercrimes like spam and password stealing are the same as those of phishing. Economics long ago established that common access resources make for bad business opportunities. No matter how large the original opportunity, new entrants continue to arrive, driving the average return ever downward." Meanwhile, the Obama administration continues basing its policies on fear-mongering, currently working with the House and Senate on over 50 cybercrime bills, including the Cyber Intelligence Sharing and Protection Act, which allows the federal government to monitor private information and does it, quote, "notwithstanding any other provision of law." This means that privacy laws concerning things like wiretaps and medical privacy just won't apply. And far from improving online security, these measures would more likely undermine it, leaving new backdoors and extra systems for hackers to use to gain entry. Cybersecurity is important, but federal action on this issue is a cure far worse than the disease. Of course, in such an environment of police abuse, rampant and irresponsible debt, and the gainsaying of the Constitution, it all stands to reason that our government would want to stop as much speech as they can get away with, and when it comes to a significant gathering like the G8 NATO summit, they're ready to go all out. Chicago police have plans in place to use long-range acoustic devices, or LRADs, on people protesting the summit. These devices can send out high-frequency alarm tones directed at protesters without harming others in the area. These devices have already been abused. The ACLU has sued on behalf of a bystander at the G20 summit in 2009 who suffered pain and permanent hearing loss after police used an LRAD against her. She wasn't even protesting, just observing, and when she became concerned that the police were getting too active, she tried to leave and was blasted with a piercing sound lasting several minutes, without even so much as a warning. We have a First Amendment right to free speech. We have a First Amendment right to free assembly. We have a First Amendment right to petition the government. Committing such acts against protesters is nothing short of the very behavior our government uses as an excuse to invade and attack other countries. And now it's time to stick a feeding tube into this week's biggest Bogon emitter. And yet again, it goes to the news media for their moronic coverage of the death of a New Zealand woman, Natasha Harris. Of all the factors that led to her death, the news stories focus on one, for no other reason than sensationalism: Coca-Cola. Harris died of a heart attack in February at age 30. She suffered from hypokalemia, a potassium deficiency. The statement that the press has seized on and spread far and wide had to do with the amount of Coke she drank. 2.1 to 2.6 gallons a day. Okay, that's a lot of Coke, and there's no way it was good for her. It's right that the pathologist included it as one contributing cause of her death, but the news media deserve brickbats for continually singling it out. Harris had very poor nutrition, and according to her partner, Chris Hodgkinson, she ate very little. Deficiencies are usually associated with what you don't eat and drink rather than what you do, so you'd think that would be more significant than the Coke thing. Oh, and she also smoked 30 cigarettes a day. Gee, you think that might have had something to do with her fatal heart attack? The news got so widespread that Coca-Cola Oceania released a statement regarding the safety of its products, pointing out that even water can be toxic at high levels. And before you go thinking that's a bogus statement, it isn't. Water poisoning is a very real problem. People have died in drinking contests and over long periods of exercise where water is consumed without replenishing electrolytes. In fact, depending on things like your weight and your diet, drinking 2 or 3 gallons of water a day can cause water poisoning. So Coke's statements are in no way bogus, especially given the amount that she drank. And the weird thing is, since 12 ounces of Coke contains 42 milligrams of sodium and 46.5 milligrams of potassium, she might well have been worse off in that regard if she drank water instead of Coke. Singling out Coke in this matter just has no intellectual justification whatsoever. The fact is, she died because she smoked a lot and had a terrible diet, and the Coke was just one aspect of that. Trying to sensationalize that one aspect and implicitly blame Coke for her death just betrays everything the news media is supposed to be doing, which is why, like many times before, they represent this week's biggest Bogon emitter. And now it's time to bend, fold, and mutilate the indelible indecency of this week's Idiot Extraordinaire! The Leadership Conference of Women Religious, which represents 80% of Catholic nuns in the U.S., has come under fire from the Vatican for, quote, serious doctrinal problems. And what were these problems? Basically, focusing too much on poverty and economic problems, and not enough on hating gays and promoting sexism. According to the censure issued by the Vatican's Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the group's position on homosexuality and women in the priesthood made them guilty of promoting, quote, radical feminist themes incompatible with the Catholic faith. They also cited the group for keeping silent on issues of abortion and same-sex marriage. According to the group's executive director, Sister Simone Campbell, quote, I'm stunned. We haven't violated any teaching. We've just been raising questions and interpreting policies. Questions the Vatican apparently doesn't like and has no answer for. Strange that the Catholic Church justifies its existence to the rest of the world on the good works that it does, and then turns around and takes an action that shows quite clearly that it thinks the good works aren't as important as hating gays and segregating women. Here's a question to ponder. Would anything like the current policy exist if women had been allowed to be priests? The Vatican has also been conducting a widespread investigation of all women's religious orders in the United States. The investigation was finished last December, but the results have not been made public yet. Gee, I wonder why. Could it be that they don't want the scrutiny that would result from making their conclusions known? After all, just the bigoted and hateful comments they made about this group of nuns was enough to land them the title of this week's Idiot Extraordinaire! Well, that wraps up this F the Police, Set and Release, War and Peace, Axle Grease, Morbid Obese, Good for the Geese, Fly by the Seats, and Out on the Streets edition of the Bogosity podcast. Please visit the forums at bogosity.tv, where you can read the show notes and join the discussion on these and other subjects. This podcast is free, but not free to produce, so please use the donate button at the top of the Bogosity.tv website or down the right-hand side of the podcast page and give generously to keep this podcast going. And if you'd like to contribute to the podcast, just send a question, statement, news article, or rant to podcast@bogosity.tv. Put it in an audio file, and if it's good enough, it'll get played right in the podcast. Thank you for listening. Until next time, here's a quote from William S. Burroughs. I sure as hell wouldn't want to live in a society where the only people allowed guns are the police and the military. The Bogosity podcast is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 3.0 Unported license.
Bogosity.